Hey everybody, welcome to part 2 of the sculpting portion of this tutorial series. So we covered how to sculpt wood in my last video, and in this video I want to try to cover as many of the other materials as we can, including the metal, the glass, the leather on the chest, and the rope. I'm going to make a separate video and go over the books. I want to make sure that these kind of have their own special treatment, just because there's a little bit more going on with the books. So we'll cover that later. So with the metal, let's go ahead and start here, because I think this will be fairly quick actually. Now there's not a whole lot that I can really say about how I sculpt metal, other than it is quite different than sculpting something like stone or wood. And that's because metal is a pretty different material, obviously. Wood usually chips and splinters. I think I mentioned that in the last video. So when something chips or splinters, it has a very hard edge kind of to it. So you see how if I was chipping this along, you see how it creates these lines right here? And this kind of gives off the look that it's been sort of chipped, not really dinged. Metal kind of gets dinged or it melts. So when I do metal, especially metal edgeware, I'm going to use a brush. I'm going to use the Trim Dynamic brush. The reason I like this brush is because it doesn't have those sort of like harsh edge kind of chips to them. This, if you see here as I'm sculpting along, you see how it's kind of smooth. It kind of almost looks like butter a little bit. And that's because metal is malleable, which means that metal, when it gets hot, it can deform, it can sort of warp a little bit. And that's what makes this material fairly unique when you sculpt it. So to me, metal can be as simple as you want it to. Realistically, I wouldn't necessarily have to do anything to this, and I could just put a smart material on here and give it some metalness and roughness and call it a day. But when it comes to stylized metal, I like to just sort of sculpt all of the edges a little bit and just give it a little bit of personality. So I'm going to go ahead and start here and just start to go over all of these edges just a little bit. And I want to try to go over them and have them be somewhat even, but every once in a while we could go through and sort of like ding down something like this, make a little dent in there every once in a while to sort of break up the evenness. So just kind of going around here. Now with this piece in particular, I don't really need to worry too much about the back side of it, because I think just by looking at this, I will probably delete those back faces anyway, because you're never going to see them. So there's really no point to sculpt something that you won't see. There's a couple other brushes that I sometimes use. I think we talked about the Orb Flatten brush. So if I bring that here, this is pretty unique as well. It's a little bit more, I should say, unforgiving than the Trim Dynamic brush, because the Trim Dynamic brush, it just has a really soft quality and a soft feel to it. The Orb Flatten brush is good because it creates these like micro dings in here, as you can kind of see that, which I really do like. And it's, you know, a little bit sharper. And in this instance, I think that this actually is working out quite nicely. You can see that when I use the dynamic brush first and then come back in with an orb brush, that it really just works well together. Now I could try just using the orb flatten edge on its own, but you can see that just because this brush works really well when it's got a surface to kind of grab onto. So if you're trying to just do an edge right here, you can see that the surface area that makes up this edge, it's really small. So this brush just kind of has a hard time going in and getting some of those edges. So what makes it easier is just to take this Trim Dynamic brush and just kind of go over it first pretty lightly, and then come back and sculpt it with the Orb Flatten edge. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for this entire little section here on this piece, and I'll come back and we'll talk about what happened. All right, so now you can see after doing a first sculpting pass on here, just kind of how quickly that came together. All I did was just sculpt on the edges of this to kind of pop out those bevels. Now, something that I used to do a lot was I used to try to, instead of having a sharp edge around all of these, I would actually go and bevel inside of Maya before coming in and sculpting in ZBrush. So I want to talk about the H polish brush really quick because it's one of my favorites. And the hotkey for that is BHP. And again, I don't like to put any alphas on here usually. So what this brush does is it kind of just does exactly as it says. It polishes up the edges, and it does so without being completely destructive. So you can kind of see in here, you can see where there's, a little bit of some facets going on in here. Like there's a line here. It just kind of looks a little uneven. So if you just lightly brush your way with this, it starts to just soften all of that out. And that's one of the reasons I like this brush a lot, because it just kind of softens all of the sort of, in my mind, the flaws that I made. And it just smooths it out really nicely. So this is something I highly encourage you to use if you don't already. And I'm just going to do a treatment really quick over the entire thing. All right, so in a nutshell, this is essentially how I get my bevels for metal. So next, what I want to talk to you about is I want to go over a little bit more about these sort of divots and dents that I put inside. So the reason why we do this and why it is convincing that it's metal is that, like I said before, metal dings a different way than wood does, and it's pretty malleable. So if you were to, say, strike this with a hammer, it would leave a ding, something like this. So it's just a way to convey to the viewers that this object is in fact metal and not wood or any other type of material. So you can use the H polish brush. I mean, essentially you can use any kind of brush you want to leave these marks here. One brush that I like using is, I believe it's the Orb Clay Tubes. I like this brush because it has a nice alpha associated with it, and it's a pretty intense little brush as well. So what you can do with it is you can kind of dig into the mesh like this, and then go over it again and give it a little smooth, and then you can kind of see what this does. It sort of acts similar to the clay buildup brush or the clay brush, with just a little bit more finesse than that. So it's a good way to kind of come in and add these sort of dings on the edges. Now you don't want to add too many because then it starts to look kind of polka dotty. You really just want to come in and just add them here and there to kind of give it that appearance of, being dinged a little bit. And what you can do as well with the H polish brush, because it's a very forgiving brush, it works really well and it leaves a sort of soft indentation. So like you could go in and just kind of softly push in to the mesh here like this. And this is something that I love doing with all sorts of metals, because it just kind of adds a really nice larger surface detail. And again, it's all about reinforcing the idea that this is metal and nothing else. So just doing something like this. And again, I don't want to go too overboard because this object is fairly small. So I think if you start adding a lot of tinier details on it, it starts to fall apart a little bit. It doesn't really look as good. I think this could probably be okay for now. I don't think we really need to go in too much more depth with something like this because, again, it's already a really interesting shape. And all I'm trying to do is show that it's metal, and the majority of the time you're going to sell this by, well, having a metal texture associated with it. The sculpt is really just here to reinforce all of that. All right, so let's take a look at the back side here. Now with the other two sort of clasps that we have here, I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up for those two, since it's essentially the same object as this, just kind of skewed and warped a little bit different. But what I want to do is I want to sculpt on this back side here, because this is clearly a pretty important piece. It has this sort of really beautiful logo on it, and I wanted to go ahead and sculpt this and make this metal, sort of a metal inlaid icon or logo. So before, what I mentioned was that I wanted to have this be sculpted with symmetry, and the reason for that is because when I was planning ahead, I know that I'm gonna go ahead and only have one of these sides on my UV sheet, and then I'm just gonna mirror it. So if it's gonna be mirrored, that means I can control what the mirror is gonna look like if I sculpt on both sides. If I only decided to sculpt on one side and then later on I flip it and mirror it, you might be able to see a lot of different marks that you made that don't really work super well. So this is just a good way to control, how much you can see on the other side. So I'm going to use the same exact techniques with this backside while having symmetry turned on. And I'm just going to go ahead and sculpt this up the exact same way that I sculpted the other object. And I'm really just trying to show you the most simple way to do something, because I personally think that if you can master doing something really simple, then you can master doing something really hard and more complicated as well. But also that these are in fact the methods that I use for sculpting all of these different types of materials. And I don't want to sugarcoat that. There's nothing really too much more that I do. It's all just very simple and sort of handcrafted, and it's just done with a lot of thought and a lot of care put into it. So with that said, I'm going to speed this up and I will see you on the other side. Alright, so now that that is done, I can kind of talk a little bit about what I did here. So I just used the exact same techniques as I mentioned before, and you can see that I do have some dings that I added in here, but I think the majority of the convincing work that was done was just using the H-polish brush on the actual surface area on the top here. You can see that it almost kind of looks like hammered metal, and I actually really liked how that turned out. So there are definitely some areas that you can see some noticeable repeat on each side, but I think overall when you squint your eyes, you're still only looking at the big forms, and the smaller forms, those little dings and stuff down here, those are kind of secondary. It's not something that really catches my eye, and that's sort of, why I wanted to sculpt using symmetry. So we can take a look at it in context from the back here. And I think this is just going to look really, really good, having this little imprint of metal on the back here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sculpt the rest of the metal parts here. You can see we just have some hinges and the actual clips that are on the back here. And I don't think there's any other part in here that's metal. I think that there's this sort of copper handle right here, but I will probably not sculpt that just because it's so small. I don't know if it really warrants sculpting. We'll see. When I get there, we'll see. But I don't think we're going to really need to do too much with this. Plus, this handle gets repeated several times, so I think keeping it the way it is probably going to be okay. So I will sculpt the rest of the metal pieces on here, and then I'll come back. And if there's, again, anything that I missed, that I didn't cover in these two examples right here, I will make sure to include after I am done sculpting. So I will see you on the other side yet again. Alright everybody, welcome back. So now that the metal is completely sculpted, I don't think there's really too much that I need to go over. I think I pretty much covered everything earlier. I did want to, however, mention that if you notice that I did not sculpt any of these smaller little pieces, for example here, and you'll notice as well over here, this little piece here. It'll zoom in, there we go. The reason I didn't sculpt those pieces is because, well, they're really just small. They're really too small to sculpt, and it can kind of get a little muddy and just a little too much. You know, when you have a sculpt where you have all these big forms here, look at the size of a piece like this. It's really, really small. So it's not going to hold a lot of sculptural detail, and it doesn't really serve that purpose. So I'm not going to worry about that. And I think because overall this asset is, 90% wood, that's where I'm going to spend the most time and give the most effort, because that's going to be the majority of what you see versus the metal, which I could probably, if I were to guess, maybe 5% that you see. Like it's 5 or 10% of the overall asset. So I'm not going to really focus so heavily on that. I think if there were more metal pieces to this, I'd probably emphasize that a little bit more. So those are probably the final things that I'd say about the metal. So let's go ahead and let's move on to the next material. And I think for that next material, we're going to talk about how to do the ropes. So let's bring over the reference. So you'll notice that you see how we have these kind of lines, and the rope is kind of, the silhouette of the rope is, well, it's kind of pushed out a little bit on all of these. What I started to do a long time ago was I used to either use the custom brushes that come with ZBrush. I believe there's a few rope brushes that you can drag and pull out, which do work well, but for our purposes, we have a very specific shape that we want to try to hit for all of these. So we do have this rope right here. We have a rope here and these two up here. I'm not going to count this one up here. This to me is more of like a string or maybe a yarn, and I wouldn't say that its thickness warrants it to be rope-like. So the way that I like to do rope is I like to use a black and white rope texture, and you'll see I have one here. And what this is used for is to deform a rope shape over your mesh. So actually what I have done here in Photoshop is I pulled this image here off of the internet and I basically turned it black and white and put a levels adjustment over it to kind of pop out the whites and the darks and made sure that it tiled. And that's basically it. So if you have a texture that looks like this, that tiles, it's going to work no matter what. So when I have that, I basically go into Maya. You'll see that I've already wrapped my UVs for the rope for this, but let's go ahead and use this as an example. But I'm going to go ahead and walk you through how I would set this up. So in my hypershade, all I've done, and this is very easy, is I've grabbed the texture that I made in Photoshop, and actually this is a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and re-import this by just hitting reload. So now that I've got my texture on a material inside of Maya, I'm going to go ahead and put this over here. You can go ahead and you can either drag and drop this material onto the asset you want. And then let's go ahead and open up our UV editor. You'll see that the tile is repeating quite a bit over here. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for now. So this already has its UVs on here, but let's go ahead and pretend that it doesn't. So I'm going to go ahead and just take this and delete it in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to select this rope. And my favorite way that I like to do unwraps is to do camera-based projections, which is up here with the little camera icon. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and it's going to project the UVs based off of where I have the position of my camera in the scene. So next, let's go ahead and make our seam. The seam is going to be on the inside of the rope because this is going to be where no one is most likely to see the seam. So let's go ahead and isolate this. I'm going to go ahead and just select this line. This is where I want my UV seam. And I'm just going to go ahead and do a cut. Now I'm going to go ahead and select everything, and I'm going to go ahead and unfold. And there we have it. Nice and UV'd. So basically at this stage, what I'm going to do is with the concept on the other side, you see how we have, let's see, 1 loop, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to try to map the UVs as closely as I can to make it look like, you know, pretty close to what the concept is. You see how we only have 1, 2, 3 loops. So I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and stretch this up a bit more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe just a little bit more. There we go, something maybe like this. And it doesn't really matter where it's sitting in the 0 to 1 space in here, because ZBrush really doesn't care too much about that, but I'm just going to basically have it sitting right here for now. And that's it. That's all I do with the UVs. So then from there, go ahead and close that. With all of the other ones UV'd, which look good, I'm going to go ahead and make it easy on myself. I'm going to go ahead and combine all of the ropes in here that I want. Put that back in its group. Let's go ahead and export this out as an FBX. I'm going to call this rope. Save that out. Okay, now let's go back into ZBrush. Now, once we're in here, let's go ahead and I'm just going to select this poly mesh because I like to sometimes open up a new file, not with the sculpt that we're currently working on. So let's go ahead and just go to import. Let's go ahead and go to our folder, open up rope. Okay, so you'll notice that it came in with a texture already loaded on here. I believe I already have a texture that was in here. Sometimes what it will happen is if you import a Maya file that has a texture associated with it, then it's going to go ahead and bring this in here. And I don't usually like that, and you'll see why in just a second. So let's go ahead and, if you don't already, your texture tab is located up here. So I just like to drag and drop this. Now what you want to do is you want to go ahead and go to texture. And let's go ahead, and you can see I've already brought it in here, but just for the sake of the tutorial, I'll go to import, and under textures, let's go ahead and get this rope alpha here. Okay, now this is a really important step that you want to make sure you do. When you bring a texture inside, like a tiling texture inside a ZBrush, for whatever reason, ZBrush will invert it on the V. So it'll kind of make it go, it'll flip it vertically. So anytime you do something like this, when you import it, just go ahead and hit this flip V, flip vertically. There we go. And then let's go ahead and hit this button here. It says make alpha. It'll make that into an alpha. Okay, so with all of our ropes combined, it's what we want. Let's go ahead and you'll notice that after importing it, if I go to our UV map, you'll notice that it has UVs associated with it because it says delete UV. So if you brought an asset in here that didn't have any UVs, this option right here would be grayed out and you wouldn't be able to select delete UV. Now we don't need to do anything with this. So let's go ahead and go to our texture map. You'll notice that it already has an existing texture on here, which we don't want. So under texture map, we'll select this and let's go ahead and select the texture that we just made, which would be this one. There we go. And let's go ahead and give this some subdivisions as well. I'm just going to go ahead and Control D. And I think that maybe 4.5 million will probably be okay, because you have to remember that these active points are shared with all of these, and you'll see why it's important to have topology on all of them. So let's go ahead and we'll close texture map. Let's open displacement map. You'll notice nothing is selected in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the same exact texture. The texture map, the only reason why I actually load this one in here is because this allows you to basically see where the texture is getting applied to. So let's say if you accidentally forgot to UV a section, or maybe something's wrong in the UVs, doing this step will allow you to see any mistakes that you made. But realistically, this is just kind of a map for you to see what's going on here. The real magic happens with the displacement map. Okay, so under displacement map again, the only thing that we want to worry about is this intensity slider. Now this thing is pretty finicky. If you move it up just a little bit, you'll notice how this gets really dark in here. Now nothing's happened yet. This is just basically showing you a preview of the intensity of the displacement. So if I were to go ahead and this is 0.05. If I went ahead and hit apply displacement, well, that doesn't look really convincing. It's a cool shape. Maybe we could use that for something later, but it's not the kind of rope that we want. So it's a pretty touchy system, and that's totally okay. So let's go ahead and set it to something super low, like 0.01. You'll notice how the intensity preview looks a little bit better. So let's go ahead and hit apply. So that actually doesn't look too bad. That looks pretty good. Let's see if we can go even lower and see if that helps. So I don't mind this either. This is kind of nice. Let's go ahead and take our texture off. We can just toggle this off to see what that looks like. So I might actually do it. Let's go ahead and see. The reason why I kind of like this is that it's not too overbearing, like the texture's not too extreme, but I also want to make sure that we have some good silhouettes on here. You just have to undo if you want to test it again, just like this. Let's do 0.009. Yeah, I don't mind this because if you look at a distance here, if I take the texture off, you can really see the silhouette of the rope starting to form. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like with our asset. So let's go ahead and select back on our mesh here. So let's go ahead and select on our subtool that we've been working on. And let's go ahead and, for right now, what I'll do is I'm just going to go through and select these ropes, and I'm just going to delete them for now. For whatever reason, I can always just re-import the original mesh if I need to. Now all we need to do is go to append, and I believe this is where our ropes are right here. We'll go and select that. They should pop in right exactly where the other ropes were. So if we look at our concept now, so I'm noticing that these ropes are a little bit thinner than what's going on over here, trying to decide if I actually like that or not. I don't mind these ropes down here being as big as they are because it kind of looks nice. So I think overall, yeah, I don't mind if these are actually a little bit thicker, and in the end, I can always come in and actually just make them a little bit smaller if I wanted to, maybe just a little bit thinner. So for now, I think I'm gonna go ahead and just leave that alone. Now I'm actually gonna go back a step. I actually wanna make sure that I show you what can happen if you don't have enough topology. So if I go back and I go to our geometry tab, and let's go ahead and just decrease this to, let's say 70,000, and I delete the higher. So if I go ahead and go back to displacement, and I go ahead and I displace this again, you'll notice how actually this does have enough topology to sort of hold the shape still. But the problem with that, if I remove the texture, is that you can see the actual topology now in the rope. So if this was going to be your high poly, let's say if we just tried to smooth it, you can see that it's leaving these sort of weird stretch marks on it. And we really don't want that. It's just a little bit too low. So it needs to have enough supporting geometry to displace it properly. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this. It's better to go higher because you can always drop it down lower later than to go lower at the start. But this is essentially how I do basically any kind of ropes. And the reason for that is because it just gives you the freedom to place ropes anywhere you want in the scene, and then basically go ahead and unwrap them inside of Maya or whatever application you're using. And then once they're unwrapped, you can basically just come into ZBrush and just displace them where they are. So I always found this to be a really, really unique and awesome trick to do ropes and all sorts of other things. So this application right here doing the displacement actually has a lot of power. So I suggest you kind of look into this method a little bit more if you want to know more about that. All right, everybody. So moving right along, I think the next thing that I'd like to go ahead and tackle would be this sort of leather trim that's going on here. It's sort of like this piece and this piece here, as well as the piece down here. And I think we can go ahead and start by doing this piece down here because it's a little bit smaller. So if we work on something that's just a little bit smaller, it might be easier to come up here and sort of do the same sort of treatment up here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, if we see this piece down here, I think it's pretty cool. There's some really cool markings down here. For the most part, there's not like a whole lot of really big edge wear. So I think we can kind of keep the leather on here fairly simple. Okay, but first what I want to do is let's go ahead and take a look at this leather strap here. I think I want it to be a little bit thicker. It seems like it might be a little bit too thin. So let's go ahead and just thicken that up just a little bit. Okay, not bad. And let's go ahead and give it another subdivision level. So I think what we can do is something a little bit similar to what we did with the metal, and that is to just go ahead and maybe just distress some of the edges a little bit. And we can do that with the trim dynamic brush. We can kind of go through here as well and kind of smooth out some of these faceting. We can also use the H polish brush as well. Maybe we can lower the intensity. Okay, so let's go ahead and take our trim dynamic brush and let's go ahead and just kind of go over the edges a bit. And again, we can go over this a second time using our H polish brush to kind of clean up all of these edges. This is just really to catch the highlight of the light. If we have something that's really sharp and angular, it's not really going to catch the light. Leather is one of those things where you can kind of go a little overboard really quickly if you wanted to. I think if you wanted to pan a leather texture over this, you could probably do that, but for stylized, I think it's more of the impression of leather. Like, I don't think it would be necessarily the best idea to actually have a sort of leather texture over here. So it's always about implied details. If you can make 2 marks and convince someone that it's leather, then I think you've pretty much done your job. A lot of this will come through in the actual texturing phase. So let's go ahead and use our H polish and just kind of go through and just kind of soften and smooth some of this out just a bit. Just kind of add some asymmetry as well. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. I think what we can do is, I kind of like how this is coming over a little bit. I think we can emphasize that a bit more. Maybe over here too, and just create a little bit of edge wear, a little bit of asymmetry. And then of course we can come in here and, you know, sort of every once in a while, put in some brush marks. And we'll just kind of make a little indent in here. Something that can be seen from pretty far away. We might be able to use the orb clay brush, the clay tubes, just kind of dig into the mesh a little bit. And then smooth it back out. Sometimes all you need to do is just make a few marks, and that's enough. So let's see what something like this might look like from a distance now. I think maybe smoothing this out a little bit more probably be good. Yeah, I don't think there really needs to be too much more with this. I think it looks pretty good. I'm actually going to see really quick what the inflate brush will do, just to maybe thicken up some of this just a bit more. There we go. I think it was just getting a little bit too thin. I think adding in a little bit of extra thickness will help it just feel a little bit more, you know, stylized. Actually, we can do a flatten brush as well. That'll help to kind of smooth some of the irregularities out. Yeah, I think something like this is pretty good. Again, it's really small. I don't think if it was something that was pretty big, I would probably, you know, put a little bit more care into it, but it's a very small thing. So let's go ahead and do the same technique. Let's go ahead and do that up here with these pieces here. Using the trim dynamic brush, let's just kind of go ahead and just kind of start to slowly chip away at these edges just a little bit. I know in the concept the edges are a little bit sharper, but I think for the sake of the sculpt, it might read better to have them be a little bit more pronounced. Because you have to think too, this leather would be stretched and wrapped over the wood. So just kind of thinking about like what material is underneath this one. That can help to kind of put things in perspective as well. So in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty small bevel. It's not that big, so maybe we could push this a little bit more if we wanted to. Maybe we can isolate this piece here. Just kind of go on this side. So again, the reason I'm not using the trim smooth border brush is because, again, leather is pretty malleable. It's kind of squishy and it doesn't chip like wood does. Therefore, I'm going to make sure I use a brush that doesn't have a square alpha and it's got something that's pretty squishy, if you will. Just kind of like dents the surface just a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and take our H polish brush and we'll just go over this like everything else. Now, the one thing we can do to sort of set this apart from it looking like a metal is we can actually use the orb slash brush, because if leather gets cut, it definitely will actually like show a cut a little bit easier than metal would. So if we went ahead and just did something like this, we could kind of do something like that just to kind of pull it out of, you know, it feeling a little bit too much like metal. I'm gonna go ahead and just move this up slightly. Yeah, so our textures are really gonna do a lot of the work here to sort of help set this material apart from the actual metal. So let's go ahead, maybe on this top piece right here, maybe on this one, we can just sort of not go as heavy as the other piece. Like maybe what we can do is just kind of like do a little bit of edge damage here, come over here and do some more. Maybe we can make this sort of like pretty pronounced here, make it a little bit bigger. Smooth it out. Kind of give these corners a little bit of edge wear. You know, I might find like when we come to the texturing phase, maybe it does need like a really slight sort of like leathery texture that goes with it. I'm kind of thinking that's what we'll have to do to really help sort of sell this to be leather. So let's just see, just with those few markings, maybe we can do an H polish and we can come in here and just kind of make a little bit of marks in here every once in a while. Just to add some surface detail. I always like adding all these small little kind of dents and dings in here. I think it just kind of plays up the fun, stylized aspect of it, because you don't really see too much real world items getting damaged like this. At least nothing that I can recall off the top of my head. So I think just having a few little dings, it kind of just shows that this has a little bit of age and wear to it. So one thing that leather does do that's a little bit different than metal is it kind of, when you poke a hole into it, something similar to what we have here, it sort of raises the edges up a little bit. And what I mean by that is if I go ahead and take the orb clay tubes brush and I kind of help emphasize this hole a little bit more, I'm just going to build up a little bit around this edge here, something like this, and kind of smooth it out a little bit, something similar to this. So you can start to see how like the leather would raise up a little bit, showing that it's, you know, has a hole kind of poked into it. That's just how leather works. So what you could do on the distressed edges is you could just kind of come through like I've done here and just sort of build up a little bit around the edges. Kind of shows like that level of distress, that wear. You gotta really make sure that you smooth it though. And we can also kind of come through on the other side here. Really smooth this out. This will kind of help reinforce that, you know, the leather is just kind of, you know, for a lack of a better word, squishy, kind of malleable. And you don't have to do this everywhere. I think showing this every once in a while helps reinforce who's ever viewing this that this material is leather. So if you did it everywhere, it might be a little bit sort of like in your face, like kind of obvious, you know? I'm just trying something really quick, seeing if I like that. But I think what we can do instead and make it a little bit more convincing is we can go to our brush and select an orb slash. And if we wanted to, we could like make a mark here, something similar to that. And then we can go through with our clay tubes and just sort of go over the sides here. Just to show the leather has been peeled back a little bit. And it's not completely, it's not like a super sharp mark. I think even something like this could work pretty well. Yeah, I kind of like that. I don't mind the asymmetry of that. I'm just going to go through and just sort of make some bigger holes on the sides. Okay, so now that this leather chest is looking a little bit better, I think what we could do is just sort of move on to the leather straps here as well. So one of the things that I want to do first is I'm going to go ahead and take the move brush and I'm just going to kind of see if I can move this piece a little bit and kind of deform it into a shape that's not so square. Something kind of similar to the concept. And I think already this is doing a good job. And I'm going to even kind of maybe just kind of wiggle the shape around a little bit. So that way it's not perfectly 90 degrees straight. I think having a little bit of like undulation in it will just kind of add to its character. And it kind of makes it feel a little bit more believable. Just kind of take our H polish brush and we can just kind of go over some of these areas after I've moved it. I'm going to do this for a little bit and just see if I can get a little bit more of an interesting shape going on. Yeah, I think even something like this, I think that's a little bit better than what we had before. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same exact treatment that we did with the rest of the leather parts. All right, so that's already starting to look so much better. So you can see the difference between each of these straps. This one just has a lot more character now. It's got more movement to it. It sort of breaks the silhouette of it being perfectly straight. So I'm actually really happy with how that turned out. All right, so I believe there is just one more leather piece that kind of goes along the back side here. And I'm going to go ahead and just go ahead and sculpt that up as well, giving it the exact same treatment as before. All right, so you'll notice that I didn't touch these back pieces here. And that's because after I started sculpting this, I realized, well, hey, this is basically just the same exact piece. I just duplicated it back. So that's great for us. That means I only have to sculpt this piece once, and we'll just duplicate this when the time comes. So I think I'm going to go ahead and delete this leather strap so I know that I don't need to have another one sculpted. All right, so we are getting pretty close to finishing up the majority of all of these pieces. I think the next thing that we can work on really quickly is this stone right here. So let's go and look at the concept. If I pull this up here, we have this rune stone, which looks pretty cool. Now, there's a couple of ways we could approach this. You'll notice how it's got some cool engraving on it. It looks kind of similar to the one we did before, but we could try to make our own that matches this, or we could use the one that we used before. So I'm not really too sure on that just yet, but what we can do is go ahead and start sculpting the stone up a little bit more. The nice thing is that it's really simple. It's not going to require a lot of sculpted work. So I'm going to go ahead and get out the trim smooth border brush. Let's go ahead and put a square alpha on here. And I'm just going to go ahead and start to just sculpt this up just a little bit. If you've seen my previous tutorials on how I sculpt rocks, this is pretty much the exact same techniques that I use. So I'm not going to go into this too much other than just sort of using the trim smooth border brush a little bit to add some cool facets and kind of shape this up a little bit. And because it's such a small asset, like it just really doesn't matter too much. I think the only thing that really matters is this surface right here, because the runestone engraving is going to go on there. So all I'm doing is just trying to get rid of the facets that I got in the blockout and try to just make this appear to be really smooth, right? A lot of runestones are typically pretty small, pretty smooth, almost like a pebble that you might find, like, or a rock you might find in the beach or like in a river. That's kind of what I'm imagining this to look like. So just kind of going over. We can kind of sculpt on the top a little bit. Let's go ahead and get our H polish brush out and start to literally just polish this up a little bit. You could even get out the flatten brush too. That's always a good one to sort of help smooth things out. And again, I'm not going to go too crazy on this. If this was a lot bigger and the emphasis was on the runestone, I would probably pay a lot more attention to it. Maybe we can just kind of sculpt up the bottom here so it's not totally flat. Sort of, even though we won't necessarily have the bottom faces here to be showing, we might as well kind of sculpt them up just a little bit, just to imply that this is smooth on the other side. So I'm just using the orb flatten edge brush to sort of give it some texture, some sharpness, and then coming back and just kind of sculpting some of that out again. Just adds some interesting internal shapes to it. And maybe we can just kind of sculpt just a little bit on this surface. So when I think about something that needs to be carved on a runestone, I think about this in two different ways. I think one, I could potentially, I notice that that's actually kind of low res. Let's kind of go ahead and get that up res. There we go. All right, so one way we could think about this is we could do the same exact treatment before where we actually just make an alpha and then stamp it on here. That could also work. Or what you could do is you could just wait until you get to the texturing phase, and then when you get there, what you can do is you could actually just paint it on with like a height map inside of Substance Painter. So it really just depends on a lot of different things, really. Like if this was just a one-off piece with the rest of this, I would probably do it like I've done the alpha before, just because that's pretty simple. What I could do is I'll just kind of show you pretty quick how to do this by hand. So let's go ahead and open up a new document in Photoshop. We can just do a 1000 by 1000. Now, because this is really small, if you can see here, and it's also covered by a leather strap, that we don't really need to go too hard into figuring out what the shape looks like. I think Maeve's done a good job to sort of show us what this, really looks like. It's got some circles in there. I think it doesn't need to be too complicated. So let's just go ahead and we could actually just paint this on if we wanted to. We'll create a new layer. Let's go ahead and get our brush. Doesn't matter at all what brush you're using, but it should be fairly opaque. So it shouldn't have any sort of transparency in there. So I'm just going to do something kind of fast and simple. Maybe we could do like a circle like this. Maybe it's got a couple of lines going off here like this. And maybe it's got like another, an arch or something in here. Just kind of clean up this, make these look a little bit more like circles. Maybe we could add some imperfections in here as well, just to kind of give it some more character. And then maybe there's something that kind of comes off this side and maybe it kind of arches like this, and it's got some interesting design. I'm just kind of making this up as we go. maybe it does something like this. So nothing too crazy or special in any way, just enough for us to get something that looks kind of interesting. I'm actually going to go over that again. Yeah, there we go. Let's go ahead and we'll just go ahead and double click on this layer. We'll go ahead and click on Inner Glow. And the settings should already be pretty much set up, so making sure it's on a blend mode of screen with the opacity at 100%, set the technique to precise, and then basically you can just kind of set the size to sort of match what you want. So I think where I had it was probably good. And I'm going to save that. Let's go ahead and save this file out. And I'm going to save this as Runestone Alpha. Let's go ahead and save that. Now let's go back inside of ZBrush. And let's go ahead and isolate this runestone here. Now let's go ahead and we'll go to our texture. Go to import, or actually let's go ahead and do this instead. Let's go to our alpha, import, into our textures folder, runestone alpha. So now that we have that, that works. So if we just kind of drag that with our H polish, actually, you know what, let's go ahead and we'll switch this to our clay brush and select our dots instead to drag rectangle and get that alpha. So now you'll see we could kind of drag something on there. Doesn't work super well just yet, so let's go ahead and open our alpha, go to modify, set our mid value to 100. Let's up our intensity just a little bit more. There we go. It's looking pretty cool. So let's just see what this looks like if we kind of just back up a little bit and see how big this needs to be. So I'll probably make it a little bit bigger. So even if it goes over the sides, actually, you know what? That kind of looks a little weird. Just try to get something that fits a little bit. Maybe something like this. I'm actually okay with it. I think that the rock or the runestone could be a little bit bigger, but I think that's probably going to be just fine. And then what we can do later is we can just kind of trace out this shape inside of Substance Painter, and we can put a little emissive glow on it, and everything will look pretty good. So we could actually just dig this hole in a little bit more. Again, it'll be so far away from the camera that, you know, you're just not going to be able to notice it too much. And that's going to be fine. So I actually forgot we do have this tiny leather strap here that needs a little bit of love. So I'm going to go ahead and just start to finesse this little piece just a little bit. And we'll just give this the same treatment that we did before. All right, again, since this piece is so small, it's okay to just kind of sculpt it pretty quickly. Not that big of a deal. And I think that should work pretty well for us. All right, so it looks like we are nearing the end of how many pieces we have left to sculpt. That's currently in the scene. Now you can remember, we still have the books, we have the vegetation to do, and that's about it aside from everything that we have in here. So let's kind of finish this up here by sculpting some of the opal. Then we have the glass and the corks. So I think what we can do is let's go ahead and start on the opal. So if you remember what I had mentioned earlier, is that it's a lot easier for me to sort of take something like this and just kind of start in ZBrush and create a few pieces, and then later on we can go and sort of scatter those around. So what we can do is we can start by just dividing this a little bit, and let's go ahead and we'll Dynamesh this little piece. Okay, something like this should work. And what we can do is let's just go ahead and take our Trim Smooth Border brush, Let's go ahead and just kind of sculpt on it a little bit. Maybe we can smooth some out. I don't need a whole lot of like interesting detail in here because again, these pieces are just so small that it's not gonna matter too much and you're not gonna see a lot of the actual markings in here. So I'm gonna just maybe subdivide it a little bit more and just kind of smooth out basically all the marks that I make. Even something like this I would consider to be okay. So let's go ahead and we'll just duplicate this piece, and it doesn't matter where you move it at this stage. You can just kind of move it over a little bit. And let's go ahead and maybe we can sort of shape this one a little bit differently. Maybe make it a little bit squarer, something like this. And let's just go ahead and maybe we can take our trim dynamic brush and just kind of go over it like this a little bit. Again, this is probably the smallest sort of piece that we have for our scene. So, you know, it's important to do a little bit of work with it, but even what I'm doing currently, like I doubt most of the stuff is gonna really even show up. And just knowing that, that's okay. Because again, I think that, you know, a piece like this, they're important, but they're just so small. Maybe we can make this piece a little bit bigger. So realistically, I think I only need about 3 of these, and I think that's going to be enough to sort of get enough variety that they'll look a little bit different. And, you know, we're going to probably scatter quite a few of these around up there, and that'll be plenty. I'm not going to scatter them now though. I'm only going to just kind of sculpt on these just a little bit, and then later on I'll go ahead and scatter them. All right, so next we have our glass bottles. Now, this is kind of where it's a little bit interesting. I think that realistically, if you wanted to, you could just leave these the way they are and it would look good. I don't think that there's a whole lot that really needs to be done here. I modeled these fairly quickly, as you saw. I mean, you can see that there's a little bit of a seam here. So if you see stuff like that, you can certainly come through and just kind of smooth it out a little bit. Maybe we'll take our H polish brush and we'll just kind of lightly go over it. I think this is really dependent upon what you really like in a stylized glass. I don't think there's a whole lot that needs to be done, but I will just go through and I'm just gonna smooth everything out for now. Maybe every once in a while, I'll come through with the H polish and just kind of polish out any sort of bumps that you can see that were kind of modeled in. I think if you really wanted to, you could go through on the edges like this and just sort of emphasize them a little bit if you wanted to. But again, I think when you start doing that, you start to lose the natural sort of smoothness that glass has. So it's not one of my favorite things to do. I think it really just depends on your sculpting style, but overall, I think that, you know, it's good to show some restraint. If you have sculpt marks on everything, it's gonna look pretty noisy and it's gonna look pretty obvious that, you know, the sculptor went through and just wanted to sculpt on everything. So I think that that should be fine for now. So lastly, I think with the corks, again, with these, there's not a whole lot that you really need to do. I know that this cork is pretty much the same as this one. So if you only wanted to do one, you could and just kind of stretch it and rotate it if you needed to. Because overall, I don't think there really needs to be a whole lot done. These are kind of decisions that I would make. I don't know, I really don't think that everything has to be sculpted. I think that having a nice, clean shape without any sort of extra sculpt marks is a good way to show restraint. So I think just leaving that, honestly, I think that's going to be totally fine. Again, if you wanted to add some like little tiny holes to show that it's a cork, you totally could. I think that where I would go with this is potentially just using some different parameters inside of Substance Painter to sell that it's a cork. But again, that's totally up to you. If you want to sculpt everything just so you can show that everything is sculpted, that's, you know, that's definitely one way to do it. But I think I'll just leave it, to be honest. So let's just kind of look at what we have so far. I just like to do kind of like a once over and see if everything is sculpted. You'll notice that in here, I didn't sculpt the back sides because I realized that with the chest being opened, I don't think you're really gonna see too much of all of the wood in here, but I might go back in and sculpt that just in case, because you might actually see that from this side. So, but I think we've done a good job at getting everything in there. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So what we'll do next in the other videos is I will show you sort of how I like to do my vegetation for scenes like this. Yeah, in the next video, we're going to go ahead and do the books. And then after the books, we'll go ahead and do the vegetation and the paper. Can't forget about that. And then we can pretty much call our sculpt done. So I will see you in the next video.